Welcome to Math with Mr. J. In this video, I'm going to cover how to measure angles using a protractor and how to draw angles using a protractor. We will start with measuring and then move on to drawing. Now, as far as measuring angles using a protractor, we will go through an introductory example first, and then we will follow that up with 5 more examples. Let's jump into our introductory example where we are going to measure this angle right here. Now, when using a protractor, we have 3 simple steps. First, we need to line up the center point of the protractor with the vertex of the angle. And this is the center point right here, and we need to line it up with the vertex of the angle right here. Now keep in mind, not all protractors look the exact same, but there will be some type of indication of where that center point is. There will be some type of mark or maybe even a small hole. I also want to mention that you may also hear the center point called just the center of the protractor or even the origin of the protractor. So all of those mean the same thing. Just know that it needs lined up over the vertex. Now, once we have the center point lined up with the vertex, we move on to step 2, where we need to line up the baseline of the protractor with an arm of the angle. You may also hear the arms of angles called rays or even sides. Now, the baseline of the protractor is this line that goes across here. It goes through the center point and all the way across. Now, we want to think of the baseline as 0 degrees. It's our starting point, and we are seeing how far the angle opens up from that point, so to speak. Now, the arm of the angle is either going to go to the left or right from the center point once we have the protractor lined up. For this example, the arm that we're going to line the protractor up with is going to go left from the center point. So it's going to line up right along here. So to sum it up so far, we have the center point on the vertex and baseline on an arm, and we are lined up. Now we're ready to make the correct read. So let's look at the protractor lined up. So here's the protractor lined up on top of the angle. The center point of the protractor is lined up with the vertex of the angle, and the baseline of the protractor is lined up with an arm of the angle. Now we're ready for step 3, make the correct read. Now looking at this arm right here, it goes through 60 degrees and 120 degrees. So which is it, 60 degrees or 120 degrees? Well, there are 2 ways to determine this. The first way, we can see that this is an obtuse angle. It's greater than 90 degrees. So this has to be 120 degrees. 60 degrees is not possible. It doesn't make sense for an obtuse angle. So we can use what we know about obtuse angles and acute angles to determine this. Or our second way, if we take a look at our baseline, we see 0 degrees right here. Remember, for our baseline, this is 0 degrees. And since this 0 degrees is on the outside track of numbers, those are the numbers we want to look at for this angle. 120 degrees is the outside number here and the measurement that we are going to use. So this angle is 120 degrees. Now I do want to mention, if we have an arm of the angle going right along the baseline, then we go off of this 0 degrees and we will use the inside numbers. Now before moving on to our other examples, I do want to talk about the tick marks going around the outside of the protractor. Now you may have noticed that the numbers shown count by 10. So for example, we have 0 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, so on and so forth. Now in between each of those numbers shown, so for example, right here, right here, right here, right here, and right here, and those go all the way around, those represent 5. So specifically, if we take a look at this tick right here in between 50 and 60 or 120 and 130, that would be 55 degrees or 125 degrees. And then the smallest tick marks, which we have the most of going around the outside of the protractor, those count by 1 degree. So keep that in mind when measuring angles with a protractor. Now that we know how to use and line up a protractor, let's move on to 5 more examples where we will make the correct read. Taking a look at number 1, we have the center point of the protractor lined up with the angle's vertex. Then the baseline is lined up with an arm or ray of the angle as well. So now we need to make the correct read. This is an acute angle, so we know it's less than 90 degrees. If we look at our baseline, 0 degrees is on the inside track here. So this tells us that we're going to be using the inside numbers. Now we can see that the other arm goes through 110 degrees and 70 degrees. Well, remember, this is an acute angle, or we know that we need to use the inside numbers. Either way, 70 degrees here. So this is a 70-degree angle. Just remember, line up the center point with the vertex of the angle, then line up the baseline with an arm of the angle, and then we just need to make the correct read. Let's move on to number 2. Taking a look at number 2, we have everything lined up, and this is an obtuse angle, so it's greater than 90 degrees. Or we know we're going to use the inside numbers. Now we can see that this is either 160 degrees or 20 degrees. Well, again, obtuse angle here. So it has to be greater than 90 degrees. It's going to be 160 degrees. Or we know to look at the inside numbers. Either way, again, we get 160 degrees. Let's move on to number 3. So for number 3, it looks like we have an angle that is slightly more than 90 degrees. So this is obtuse. Now as far as the baseline, 0 degrees is on the outside track this time. So this 0, we go off of that and we use the outside numbers. The other arm of our angle goes right in between 90 degrees and 100 degrees. Now that measurement isn't labeled with a number, but like we talked about earlier, we have some tick marks that show us what this will be. This is a tick mark representing 5, so right in between 90 and 100. So this is 95 degrees here. Let's move on to number 4. Looking at number 4, we are lined up and it looks like we have an acute angle here. As far as the baseline, 0 degrees is on the outside. So we know that we will use the outside numbers. The other arm of the angle is right here in between 40 degrees and 50 degrees, or in between 130 degrees and 140 degrees. Well, again, we know this is acute, so it's going to be less than 90 degrees. And we know that we need to look at the outside numbers. So this is in between 40 degrees and 50 degrees. And we're right on the 5-degree tick mark, so this is 45 degrees. Let's move on to number 5. Lastly, for number 5, we are lined up and we have an obtuse angle. Now here we have a really specific measurement. We can see that our arm lined up with the baseline goes through 0 degrees on the inside. So we need to look at the inside numbers, or again, this is obtuse, so we know it will be greater than 90 degrees. Our other arm is right here in between 40 degrees and 50 degrees, or 130 degrees and 140 degrees. Now, knowing that this is an obtuse angle, or that we need to use the inside numbers, this is going to be between 130 degrees and 140 degrees. Now this is 130 degrees right here, so let's count from that. This is 131 degrees, 132 degrees. So this is a 132 degree angle. So there's how to measure angles using a protractor. Let's move on to drawing angles. Now we're going to take a look at drawing angles using a protractor. We will break this down into 4 simple steps, and we will go through 3 examples step by step. Let's jump into number 1, where we need to draw a 60-degree angle. Now, our first step when drawing angles using a protractor is to draw the first arm of our angle. And all we need to do for this is to use a straight edge to draw a straight line. You can use the straight side of your protractor or even a ruler. I'm going to use my protractor, and all we need to do, again, draw a straight line like this. And I'm going to put a small mark, a small dot on one end here to show where our vertex will be. This can be on either end of the line. Either will work. And that's our first arm of our angle. Next, our second step, we need to line our protractor up. The center point needs to be on the end of the arm where we made the dot, and the baseline needs to be lined up with the arm. So here is our protractor lined up. We have our center point on one end of the arm, so I'm putting it right on that dot I made. Then we need the baseline of the protractor lined up on the arm. So that line at the bottom of the protractor that goes through the center point, the baseline is 0 degrees. So line that up on the arm. So now our protractor is lined up and we need to mark the correct measurement. For this example, we need 60 degrees. Now there are two 60 degrees on the protractor. So which one do we use? Well, a 60-degree angle is an acute angle, so we need the 60 degrees that will give us that. Or using the 0 degrees from the baseline, the arm of our angle goes through the 0 degrees on the inside track of numbers. This tells us to use the inside numbers. However we want to think about it, it's going to be this 60 degrees right here. So we need to make a small mark at 60 degrees. We will use this to make our angle. And now our correct measurement is marked. Lastly, step 4, we need to draw our second arm of the angle. What we need to do is pick up our protractor and use a straight edge to connect our dot on the end of the first arm. It's where we lined up the center point of the protractor to the dot that we made at 60 degrees. Simply put, we connect our dots. So we can line our straight edge up like this. Then we need to draw the arm. So we go from the end of the arm where we had the center point to the mark we made at 60 degrees. And that's it. That's the second arm of our angle. So let's take away the protractor and see what we have. Now we have our angle, and we can draw arrows on the arms and then label the angle as well if we would like. So we are done with our angle, but it doesn't hurt to double check. So let's line up our protractor and make sure this is 60 degrees. So our protractor is lined up and it looks like we are good to go. We have a 60-degree angle. Let's move on to number 2. Taking a look at number 2, we need to draw a 110-degree angle. First step, draw the first arm of the angle using a straight edge. So a nice and straight line here. And I'm going to put a small mark, a small dot on one end to show where our vertex will be. For this example, let's put the dot on the right side. Remember, this can be on either end of the line. We can make the angle either way. And that's our first arm of our angle. Next, our second step, we need to line our protractor up. The center point needs to be on the end of the arm where we made that dot, and then the baseline needs to be lined up with the arm. So here is our protractor lined up. We have our center point on one end of the arm, so I'm putting it right on that dot I made. Then we need the baseline of the protractor lined up on the arm. So now our protractor is lined up and we need to mark the correct measurement. For this example, we need 110 degrees. Now there are two 110 degrees on the protractor. So which one do we use? Well, 110 degrees is an obtuse angle. So we need the 110 degrees that will give us that. So we can think through it that way. Or using the 0 degrees from the baseline, the arm of the angle lined up with the baseline goes through the 0 degrees on the outside track of numbers. This tells us to use the outside numbers. However we want to think about it, it's going to be this 110 degrees right here. So we need to make a small mark at 110 degrees that we will use to make our angle. So here's our small mark. And that's it for step 3. Lastly, step 4, we need to draw our second arm of the angle. So we need to pick up our protractor and use a straight edge to connect our marks, our dots. The dot on the end of the first arm, where the center point is right now, to the dot at 110 degrees. So we can line it up like this. Then we need to draw the arm. So we go from the end of the arm where the center point was to the mark we made at 110 degrees. And that's it. That's the second arm of our angle. So let's take away the protractor now and see what we have. And here's our angle. And we can draw arrows on the arms and label the angle as well. And we are done with our angle. But let's double check to make sure we have a 110 degree angle here. So let's line our protractor back up. So our protractor is lined up and it looks like we are good to go. We have a 110 degree angle. Let's move on to number 3. For number 3, we need to draw a 145 degree angle. Let's start by drawing the first arm here. And let's put a dot on the left side. That's where the vertex will be. Next, let's line the protractor up. So now we have our protractor lined up. The center point is on the dot and then the baseline is on the arm. Our protractor is lined up, so now we need to mark the correct measurement. Well, 145 degrees is obtuse. Or we know that we need to take a look at the inside numbers based on the 0 degrees that the arm goes through right here. 140 degrees is right here, and 150 degrees is right here. So 145 degrees is right in between. So let's put our mark, our dot, right outside of the protractor. We have the correct measurement marked. Now let's draw the second arm. We can pick the protractor up and connect the dots. Now we have our straight edge lined up and we can connect the dots to make the second arm. And we have our angle. Let's take the protractor away and now we can draw our arrows and label the angle. So there's our 145 degree angle. Let's line our protractor up and double check though. And it looks like we are good to go. We have a 145 degree angle. So there you have it. There's how to measure angles and draw angles using a protractor. I hope that helped. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, peace.